He never expected to find her in a bookstore. He never expected to find her at all. Damien Ashcroft had walked away from 15 years of silence, 15 years of unanswered questions, 15 years of telling himself she had simply chosen a different life. He had built an empire on that lie, brick by brick, body by body, until the lie became the foundation of everything he was. And now, standing on a rain-slicked sidewalk in a town small enough to forget, he could see her through a fogged window, older, quieter, more beautiful than memory allowed, and the entire empire trembled. Then the boy appeared beside her, 8 years old, dark eyes, a jaw that belonged to someone else entirely, and Damien Ashcroft, who had never flinched at a gun pressed to his temple, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. If you've ever loved someone so completely that losing them broke something inside you that never fully healed, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The rain had been falling since morning, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder or spectacle, but simply arrived and settled in, gray and permanent, the way grief does. Ashwick, Massachusetts wore it naturally. The town was built for weather like this. Old colonial bones, brick storefronts with hand-lettered signs, maple trees so thick with October that the leaves came down in wet clumps rather than the pretty spiraling drift that postcards preferred. Nobody moved fast in Ashwick. Nobody needed to. Clara Whitmore had the kettle on by 7:15. She filled 2 mugs, one for herself, one she set on the corner of the front counter where Evan would find it, when he shuffled downstairs, still wearing his pajama top, tucked into school pants because he always forgot to change the full outfit. He was 8 and brilliant in the specific, slightly maddening way that 8-year-olds are brilliant, capable of memorizing the entire taxonomic classification of deep-sea fish, but constitutionally unable to remember where he'd left his left shoe. Clara had stopped fighting it. The shoe always turned up. It was always in the same place, wedged between the radiator and the bottom shelf of the biography section, where Evan liked to sit and read before the store opened. Whitmore's books occupied the ground floor of a narrow federal-style building on Chandler Street, 2 blocks from the town green and directly across from a hardware store that had been in the same family since 1941. Clara had inherited the building from her grandmother, along with a collection of first-edition novels that most serious collectors didn't know existed, and a handwritten inventory log that predated computerized systems by 4 decades. She hadn't inherited money. She'd inherited something rarer, a reason to stay somewhere. She'd needed that 8 years ago. She had needed it badly. The front bell above the door gave a short, damp ring at 9:03, which was unusual because Whitmore's didn't officially open until 9:30, and the sign was still flipped to closed, and Clara was still in the back sorting a delivery of used paperbacks with one hand and holding her second cup of tea with the other. She set the mug down, wiped her palms on her jeans, and came around the shelving unit toward the front. The man standing inside the door was wrong for Ashwick in the way that a shark is wrong for a swimming pool, not because the shark has done anything yet, but because everything about its presence implies that the environment was not designed to contain it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that cost more than Clara's monthly inventory budget. His hair was dark and slightly wet from the rain, and he hadn't bothered to shake it off, which meant either he didn't care or he was accustomed to environments where someone else attended to those details. His face was angular and controlled, the kind of face that had learned long ago to give nothing away for free. He was looking at the shelves. Not at her, at the shelves. Clara stopped walking. Something in her chest did a strange sidelong thing. Not quite recognition, not quite alarm. Something older than both of those. Something that lived below language, in the part of the body that remembers what the mind has been carefully trained to forget. "We're not open yet," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The man turned, and there it was. 15 years of careful forgetting, gone in the time it takes a pair of dark eyes to find yours across a room. "I saw the light," Damien said. His accent was what it had always been. British underneath, American on top, the product of a childhood in Manchester and an adolescence spent learning to survive in places that demanded adaptability. "I apologize for the intrusion. I can wait outside." He said it like a man who had never waited outside anything in his adult life. Clara's hand was on the edge of the shelving unit. She was aware of this because her knuckles had gone white. "What are you looking for?" A pause. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, controlled, locked down before it could become legible. "A book," he said. "A specific one. I was told it might be here. Most people call ahead. I was in the area." Clara looked at him. The coat, the stillness, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, like a man who positioned himself automatically near exits. "Nobody is just in the area," she said. "Ashwick isn't on the way to anywhere." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that remembered what smiling felt like. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." She should have asked him to leave. She understood that distantly, the way you understand the structural logic of a situation even while your body is refusing to participate in it. Instead, she said, "What's the title?" "The Cartographer's Confession, First Edition, published 1923, Holbrook Press, London." The author's name was Elaine Marsh. Clara's voice was flat. Pen name. Her real name was Eleanor Marsh Colby. Her granddaughter donated a copy to this store in 1987. It's not for sale. Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Everything has a price." "Not here." Another pause. Longer this time. She watched him recalibrate, watched the slight adjustment in his posture, the fractional softening around his jaw that meant he was choosing a different approach. She'd forgotten she knew how to read him. She'd worked very hard at forgetting that. "Clara, sir," he said. Just her name, nothing else. The way he'd always said it, not as a greeting, not as a question, but as a fact. As if saying it was enough. As if her name in his mouth was a complete sentence. Her throat tightened. "You should go." "I don't think I can. That's not my problem." "No." He didn't move. "I suppose it isn't." The stairs at the back of the store creaked. The fourth step from the bottom, which always announced Evan before he appeared. Clara turned automatically, the way mothers do, that involuntary rotation of the whole body toward the sound of the child. Evan came around the shelving unit in his pajama top and school trousers, one sock on, one sock presumably still upstairs, holding his mug of tea with both hands and trailing the particular kind of distracted energy that meant he'd already been reading for an hour before coming down. He saw the man and stopped. Evan was not a shy child. He was careful, which was different. He assessed situations before entering them, had done so since he was old enough to understand that the world contained variables. Clara had always found this quality slightly heartbreaking in a child his age, that he had learned so early to look before he stepped. He looked at Damien now with calm, dark eyes. Then he looked at his mother, reading something in her face that he filed without comment. Then he looked back at Damien. "We're not open yet," Evan said. Exactly what Clara had said, the same cadence. "So I've been told," Damien said. Evan considered this. Then he crossed to the front counter, set down his mug, and said, "What are you looking for?" "Evan?" Clara started. "It's okay, Mum." He still called her Mum sometimes, a habit from the year they'd spent in Nova Scotia when he was 4, before she'd brought them back south. "I know where everything is." Damien looked at the boy. Something happened in his face, not the controlled, recalibrated expression he'd been wearing since he walked in, but something raw and unguarded that came and went so fast Clara almost missed it. Almost. "The Cartographer's Confession," Damien said, "First Edition." Evan's expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened, the look he got when a problem interested him. "That one's not for sale," he said, which was exactly what Clara had told him 2 years ago when he'd asked about the locked glass case behind the counter. "But I can show it to you if you want. Mum lets serious people look." "Evan," Clara's voice was harder now. "He seems serious," Evan said, with the complete confidence of a child who trusts his own read of a room. Damien's eyes had not moved from the boy's face. Clara watched it happen. Watched the thing she'd spent 8 years both fearing and expecting arrive without warning, without ceremony, the way the worst things always do. She watched Damien Ashcroft look at her son and begin to understand. The dark eyes, the jaw, the way the boy stood, Weight slightly forward, completely still, already positioning himself as if the room were a situation to be managed. She saw the moment Damien's breath changed. He didn't say anything. He was too controlled for that. But the silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it, and Clara's heart was suddenly doing something irregular and painful behind her ribs. Evan, oblivious to the seismic activity occurring in the adult frequency above his head, had moved to the locked case behind the counter and was reaching for the key Clara kept on the hook beside the register. "It's a really interesting book," he told Damien, in the tone he used when he decided to educate someone. "The cartographer in the title isn't a real cartographer. It's a metaphor for someone who maps things that don't exist yet. Mum explained it." "Your mother is clearly a remarkable woman," Damien said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but something underneath it was cracked open, and Clara could hear it, and she hated that she could still hear it. Evan glanced up at him with that careful, assessing look. Then he said, casually, the way children say the things that detonate, "Sir, can I ask you something?" "You can ask," Damien said. "My mum doesn't talk about my dad," Evan said. "Not with bitterness, not with the performed casualness of a kid who's rehearsed a question. Just directly, the way he did everything. She says she lost track of him a long time ago and that it was complicated. But sometimes I think—" He stopped, tilted his head. "You have the same eyes as me." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had heard in 8 years. Damien stood completely still. Not the stillness of a man controlling himself, the stillness of a man who has been hit somewhere vital and has not yet determined the extent of the damage. "Evan," Clara said, "go upstairs and finish getting dressed. I'm just— Now, please." Evan looked between them one more time with those dark, careful eyes. Then he set the key back on its hook, picked up his mug, and went back toward the stairs. The fourth step creaked as he climbed it. Then silence. Clara and Damien stood 10 feet apart in the quiet bookstore with the rain against the windows and the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of them like something structural, like a ceiling that had been cracking for years and had finally chosen this morning to come down. "Clara," Damien said. "Don't." "How old is he?" "Don't do this here." "How old?" She met his eyes. Her chin came up, the way it always had when she was frightened and refusing to show it. 8, she said. "He turned 8 in February." Damien's jaw moved. He looked away, out the window, at the rain, at nothing, and she watched him do the arithmetic that she had done 8.5 years ago in a clinic bathroom in Halifax with a paper stick in her hand and her whole world reorganizing itself around a single pink line. "You knew," he said. "When you left, I didn't leave." Her voice cracked on it, and she hated herself for that. "I didn't leave, Damien. I was taken. I woke up in a different city with no phone, no ID, no way to contact you, and a very clear message that if I tried, someone would make sure I didn't get another chance." He turned back to her. Something in his face had changed again, past the shock now into something colder and more deliberate. She recognized that too. She recognized everything about him, and it was destroying her. "Who?" he said. One word, absolute zero. "I don't know. I never found out. I just—" She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, against the ache that lived there. "I survived, Damien. I had a baby, and I built something, and I survived. That was all I could do." He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, not touching her. He stopped 2 feet away, but the proximity was its own kind of pressure. She could smell rain on his coat. She could see the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at 21. She could see the cost of 15 years on a face that had once been the most familiar thing in her world. "He asked me," Damien said very quietly, "if I knew who his father was." "I heard him." "Does he know?" "He knows what he figured out just now, apparently." She exhaled. "He's 8, Damien. He's brilliant, and he's kind, and he has never once complained about the fact that I couldn't give him an answer. So whatever you're feeling right now—" "Whatever I'm feeling." His voice was very controlled, very flat, which meant it was very dangerous. "You don't get to make this about you, not in front of him, not today." He looked at her for a long time. Then he took 1 step back, then another. He turned toward the door, and for one terrible second Clara thought he was simply going to leave, the way powerful men leave things, by walking out and letting the wreckage sort itself. And she hated how much that still mattered to her. He stopped with his hand on the door. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking out through the glass at the rain. "I need you to understand that. Whatever happened 15 years ago, whatever was done, I'm not leaving Ashwick." Clara said nothing. "I'll be back tomorrow when you're open," he said. "Officially, as a customer." A pause. "If that's acceptable." Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she had any right to expect. "The store opens at 9:30. He nodded once. Then he pushed through the door and stepped out into the rain without pulling his collar up, without any concession to the weather at all. And Clara stood in her bookstore and watched him walk away down Chandler Street the same way she'd once watched him walk toward her across a summer beach, 15 years ago, and felt the exact same thing she'd felt then, like the world had just changed its shape. She became aware slowly that she was not alone. She turned. Evan was standing at the bottom of the stairs. He'd come back down, silently in his one sock, holding his empty mug, watching her with his dark, careful eyes. "Mum," he said. "I know," she said. "Is he—" "I know, Evan." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he looked at me like he was scared. Clara's throat went tight. "I know. Grown-ups don't usually get scared of kids." "No," she said. "They don't." Evan thought about this with the serious, methodical attention he brought to everything that mattered. Then he set his mug on the counter, retrieved the key from the hook, and unlocked the glass case. He took out the cartographer's confession, carefully, the way she'd taught him, by the spine, and carried it to the reading chair by the window where he liked to sit on rainy mornings. He opened it to the first page and began to read. Clara watched her son read a book about a man who maps things that don't exist yet, and understood, with a certainty that settled through her like cold water, that the careful, ordinary life she had constructed over 8 years of survival and stubbornness had just run out of road. By noon, she knew he hadn't left town. She knew because Margaret Holt from the hardware store across the street came in for her weekly browse and mentioned, with the particular energy of someone carrying news they consider significant, that a man in an expensive coat had purchased the old Garrity building on the end of Alderman Row. Not through a realtor, not through the town's usual property channels, but in a direct cash transaction completed that morning that had apparently made the seller, Arthur Garrity's grandson, visibly emotional. "Cash," Margaret said, with the emphasis of a woman who has lived in a town where cash transactions of that scale simply do not occur. "Just walked in and handed over a certified check. Said he had plans for the building, restoration. Said he wanted to contribute to the community." Clara was shelving a box of donated hardcovers, and her hands did not stop moving. "Did he give a name?" "Ashcroft," Margaret said. "Damien Ashcroft. He's staying at the Linden Inn. Apparently he had 3 other men with him. Very quiet, very—" She searched for the word. "Attentive. Not bodyguards. Of course they weren't bodyguards. They were investment associates. They were support staff. They were whatever cover story a man like Damien had been building for the last 15 years to move through the legitimate world without it looking like what it actually was." "That's interesting," Clara said. Her voice was perfectly even. "Isn't it?" Margaret agreed, with the particular pleasure of small-town information exchange. "You know, it's funny. The Garrity building's been sitting empty since 2019. Place like that, you'd think the town would have done something with it years ago. And now, just like that—" She snapped her fingers. "A British investor shows up out of nowhere on a Tuesday." "Things happen," Clara said. "They certainly do," Margaret said happily, and moved toward the literary fiction section. Clara waited until she was alone in the back room before she allowed herself to sit down on the edge of the supply crate and put her face in her hands. Not crying. She hadn't cried in years, not really, not the deep kind. Just processing. Just holding the shape of what was happening and trying to understand how large it actually was. He'd bought a building. In one morning, cash. He was not leaving, which meant she had a decision to make, and she had until 9:30 tomorrow morning to make it. So that evening, after Evan was in bed, after homework and dinner, and the nightly argument about screen time, that Clara always lost by exactly 15 minutes. She went to the small locked drawer in her bedroom desk and took out the photograph. It was the only one she'd managed to keep. Everything else from before had been taken or left behind or deliberately severed, but this one photograph had been in her jacket pocket the night it happened, and so it had survived. A summer afternoon. A dock somewhere on the coast of Maine. Clara at 22, laughing at something off camera, her hair in her eyes, and Damien at 23, looking not at the camera but at her, with an expression on his face that she had spent 15 years trying to convince herself she'd misremembered. She hadn't misremembered. She put the photograph back in the drawer and locked it. Then she sat at her desk and did the thing she'd been avoiding for 8 years. The thing she'd told herself she'd never need to do. Because she'd told herself Damien was gone, and the past was over, and Evan was hers, and that was enough. She opened her laptop, and she typed his name into a search engine. What came back was not what she'd prepared herself for. The company listings were clean, almost performatively so. Ashcroft Development Group, Ashcroft Capital Partners, a charitable foundation operating in 5 countries, a profile in a London business magazine from 3 years ago. Nothing criminal? Nothing that would read to a casual observer as anything other than a successful international investor with a particular interest in urban revitalization and community development. But Clara had spent 8 years running a bookstore, and she knew how to read between lines. She knew what it looked like when something had been curated, when a story had been built around a different story that was never meant to be visible. She could see the architecture of it, the way the legitimate businesses were layered, the way the charitable work functioned as both genuine contribution and strategic visibility, the way the man in those clean press photos had learned to wear a different face over the one she'd known. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and went to the kitchen and stood at the window with a glass of water, looking out at the rain-wet street, the orange wash of the street lamps on the wet pavement, the maple tree at the corner losing its last leaves. Somewhere at the end of Alderman Row, in a building he'd purchased with cash that morning, Damien Ashcroft was doing whatever men like him did at 11 o'clock at night, planning, strategizing, moving pieces on a board she couldn't see. And in the bedroom upstairs, her son was asleep with his book on the pillow beside him, and his shoes, both of them for once, lined up neatly by the door. Clara drank her water. She thought about what Evan had said. He looked at me like he was scared. She thought about the expression on Damien's face in that moment before he'd locked it down, the raw, unguarded thing that had moved across his features like weather. She thought about 15 years of not knowing if someone who had once been her entire world was alive or dead, or had simply moved on without her. She set the glass in the sink. She went to bed. She did not sleep. At 9:22 the following morning, 8 minutes before she flipped the sign to open, a black car pulled up in front of Whitmore's Books on Chandler Street. It sat at the curb with its engine running. Then the engine went off. Then the door opened, and Damien Ashcroft stepped out onto the sidewalk in a different coat, charcoal this time, collar turned up against the cold, carrying nothing in his hands. He looked up at the bookstore window. Clara, standing behind the counter with her coffee, looked back. Then her phone buzzed on the counter beside her. A number she didn't recognize. She stared at it for 1 ring, 2 rings, then picked up. "I know you can see me," Damien said. She said nothing. "There's something I should have told you yesterday," he said. "Before I leave this morning, before we have whatever conversation comes next, there's something you need to know." Clara's hand tightened on the phone. Outside, through the glass, she could see him on the sidewalk with his phone to his ear, not looking at the window anymore, but at the street, the way he did when he was bracing himself for something. "The men who took you 15 years ago," Damien said. "I think I know who sent them." The coffee mug in her other hand was suddenly very heavy. "I've been trying to trace it for years," he said. "I thought it was a rival organization. I thought—" He stopped. A muscle in his jaw worked. 3 weeks ago, I intercepted a communication. Encrypted. Internal. A pause. "Clara, it came from inside my own organization. It always did." The cold that moved through her then had nothing to do with October. "Someone in your—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Someone on your side took me." Yes. And you didn't know. No. His voice was very quiet. I didn't know. She stood in her bookstore with her coffee going cold in her hand and her son's footsteps beginning overhead, the creak of his bed, the shuffle toward the bathroom, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning, and she felt the floor of the last 8 years shift under her feet. Who? She said. That, Damien said, is what I'm here to find out. He looked up at the window then, directly at her. Through the glass and the distance and 15 years of silence. But there's something else, he said. Something they know that I've only just confirmed. His voice dropped, not softer, lower, more careful. It's about Evan, Clara, and when I tell you, everything changes. Above her head, Evan's footsteps crossed the hall toward the stairs. The fourth step creaked. The fourth step creaked, and Evan's voice came down the stairwell before he did. Mom, have you seen my other sock? And Clara pulled the phone from her ear and pressed it against her collarbone like she could muffle the sound of the world rearranging itself. 1 minute, she called up. Her voice was perfect. Steady, warm, the voice of a woman whose morning was completely ordinary. She had been practicing that voice for 8 years. She put the phone back to her ear. Not now, she said quietly. Clara, he's coming downstairs. You don't say anything to him today. Nothing. Do you understand me? A pause, then, yes. Come in at 9:30. Buy a book. Act like a customer. She stopped. Can you do that? Another pause, longer. She could hear him breathing on the other end. Steady, measured. The breathing of a man who had trained himself to stay calm in rooms where other men were bleeding. I can do that, he said. She hung up. Evan appeared at the bottom of the stairs in one sock again, the other held in his hand like evidence he was presenting. Found it under the radiator. Of course you did, Clara said. The biography section radiator, not the... I know which radiator, Evan. He sat on the bottom step and put the sock on with the focused concentration he brought to small mechanical problems, then stood and came to the counter and looked at her face with those careful dark eyes that she had never, in 8 years, been able to successfully lie to. You okay? He asked. Early morning, she said. He considered this, accepted it, or pretended to. Then he picked up his mug of tea and went to the reading chair by the window, and Clara turned to face the counter and gripped the edge of it with both hands, and breathed until her heartbeat came back down to something that wouldn't show. Outside, through the glass, the black car was still at the curb. It didn't move until 9:29. He came in at 9:31, alone, which surprised her. She'd half expected the quiet men, the ones Margaret had described, to materialize behind him like a weather pattern. Instead, it was just Damien, in the charcoal coat, hands in his pockets, looking at the shelves the same way he'd looked at them yesterday, like he was buying time. Evan glanced up from his book, looked at Damien, looked at Clara, looked back at his book. The morning passed in the particular suspended tension of a room where everyone knows something is wrong and no one is saying it. 2 other customers came and went, old Mr. Beaumont picking up a reserved copy of a naval history, and a young woman from the college who spent 40 minutes in the poetry section and bought 3 things. Damien moved through the stacks slowly, pulling out volumes and reading their spines and replacing them, the practiced behavior of a man performing normalcy. At 11:15, Evan announced that he was going to the stockroom to catalog the new paperback delivery because he'd promised, and Clara had told him he could use the inventory system if he was careful, and this was more important than reading. He said this with the particular dignity of an 8-year-old who has decided to be helpful and then disappeared through the back door. The store went quiet. Damien was at the far end of the history section. He didn't turn around immediately. He finished reading the back cover of whatever he was holding, set it back on the shelf with precise care, then came down the aisle toward the counter. Clara had already moved to the space behind it. The counter between them felt intentional. She needed the 6 inches of oak. Talk, she said. He put both hands flat on the counter. He looked at them for a second, then up at her. 3 weeks ago, I intercepted a communication between two senior members of my organization, men I've known for over a decade. The communication referenced a removal operation from 15 years ago. A woman. Ashwick. He said the town's name like it was a word he'd been carrying in his mouth for a while. Your name wasn't in it, but the timeline matched. The location matched. What did it say? That the operation had been successful, that you'd been relocated and the connection had been severed. His jaw was very tight. That Hargrove had authorized it personally. Who is Hargrove? Victor Hargrove. He said the name the way you say the name of something you've spent a long time deciding how to handle. He's been with the organization since before I inherited it. He was my father's primary advisor. When I took over at 26, he stayed on. I thought he was loyal. Something moved behind his eyes. He runs the council. Every major decision goes through him. Clara was very still. Why would he care about me? Because he's spent 15 years managing the question of succession. Damien's voice was flat and factual, the way it got when emotion was too close to the surface and he was keeping it from cresting. My father's organization operates on blood inheritance. I'm 36, I've never married, I've never publicly acknowledged a child. In the absence of a direct heir, Hargrove and 3 council members have been positioning themselves to control what happens when I'm gone. The cold settled into Clara's chest slowly, like water finding a level. Evan, she said, if he's my son, he is your son. The words hit the space between them and sat there. Damien's hands pressed harder against the counter. A muscle in his forearm moved. If he's publicly acknowledged, Damien said carefully, he becomes the direct blood heir to an organization worth approximately $4 billion across 8 countries. He jumps every succession arrangement Hargrove has spent 15 years building. He looked at her steadily. That makes him a problem. He's 8 years old. I know what he is. His voice frayed at the edge, just slightly. I know exactly what he is, Clara. That's why I'm here. She turned away from him. She put her back to the counter and looked at the shelves, the orderly, alphabetized, cataloged world she had built out of nothing, out of grief and stubbornness and the specific determination of a woman who had decided that surviving wasn't enough, and she would build something instead. The cream-painted shelves, the hand-lettered section signs, the reading chair where her son sat every morning in one sock, reading about things that didn't exist yet. How long have they known about him? She said. I don't know. At least 2 years based on the communication, possibly more. They've been watching us. Yes. She turned back around. For 2 years. Possibly more, he said again. She held his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet and very precise. And it took you 3 weeks from intercepting that communication to show up in my town. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly. Damien had never done guilt in a way that looked like what other people meant by the word, but something adjacent to it. Something that understood what she was saying. I had to be sure, he said. I had to confirm the source, verify the communication, make sure it wasn't... 3 weeks, she said again. Clara. While they were watching my son. Her voice was still quiet. That was the frightening thing about it. While whoever Hargrove sent was out there on some corner of this street, watching my bookstore, watching Evan walk to school, watching us, I had surveillance on the town within 72 hours of intercepting the communication, Damien said. My people were here before I was. I needed to come myself after I... He stopped. After you what? He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and put something on the counter between them. A small envelope. The kind that comes from a laboratory. She recognized the logo in the corner. A genetic testing service, the expensive private kind. She looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. I ran it from something Evan left behind, Damien said. A cup, from this store. He paused. I know how that sounds. I know what I'm asking you to. You took something from my son without my permission. Yes. And ran his DNA. Yes. She looked at him. The silence was not comfortable. The results are in the envelope, he said. I haven't opened them. That stopped her. She looked at the envelope again. You haven't... I wanted you present when I did. He looked at her steadily. I owed you that much. The back door opened and Evan's head appeared. Mom? The inventory system's asking for the supplier code for the Brentwood shipment, and I can't find it in the folder. Back of the blue binder, Claire said. Top shelf. Got it. He disappeared again. Claire and Damien stood on either side of the counter with the envelope between them. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. She'd always had steady hands. It was the rest of her that gave her trouble. She opened the envelope, unfolded the single sheet inside, and read it. It took approximately 4 seconds because the relevant information was in the first paragraph, and the rest was technical language that she didn't need. She set it back on the counter. Okay, she said. Damien said nothing. So, she pressed her palm flat against the results sheet. What happens now? Now I deal with Hargrove. Deal with him how? He held her gaze. I'm going to dismantle his position on the council, remove his authority, expose what he did. I'm asking you how, Clara said, specifically. He was quiet for a moment. Carefully, he said, that's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She studied him, the controlled face, the careful eyes. The man who had walked into her bookstore 26 hours ago and broken open everything she'd managed to hold together. You've got men stationed around this town, she said. I know you do. Margaret Holt described them. A slight tension around his eyes. I'm not going to apologize for protecting. I'm not asking you to apologize. She cut him off cleanly. I'm asking you to be honest with me. You've got security on this street. You bought a building this morning for cash. You're planning to stay. She held his gaze. How much danger is my son in right now? Today. This morning. The pause before he answered told her more than the answer did. There's been increased activity, he said, in the last 48 hours. Communications from Hargrove's people that suggest they're aware I've accessed the information. Meaning they know you know. Meaning they're accelerating their timeline. Clara put both hands on the counter. She leaned forward slightly. Damien, how much danger? He met her eyes. More than I'd like, he said quietly. Less than it will be if we don't move quickly. Chad. She closed the store at noon, something she had not done on a weekday since the winter of 2021, when the boiler failed and the temperature inside had dropped to 40 degrees. She told Evan it was a pipe issue. He accepted this with the reasonable skepticism of a child who has learned that adults sometimes have pipe issues that are not about pipes, and went upstairs to read. Damien's men came in through the back. There were 3 of them. Not what Clara had imagined when she thought about the kind of men Damien would surround himself with. One was in his 50s, compact and silver-haired, with the precise economical movement of someone who had spent decades being invisible in rooms. His name was Carver. The other 2 were younger, late 20s or early 30s, and they moved through her stockroom with a professionalism that made her feel, in a deeply uncomfortable way, that her bookstore had become something other than a bookstore. Carver spread a tablet on the work table between the shelving units. A map. Satellite imagery. Ashwick overlaid with positions she didn't understand until Carver pointed to 4 small markers. Hargrove's contractors, Carver said. His voice was a low, flat American Midwest. We made 2 of them last night. This one, he tapped a marker near the school, showed up this morning. Clara's eyes went to the marker near the school. She said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be terrifying to say out loud. We pulled the Garrity building's permits this morning, Carver continued to Damien. We can have a clean perimeter by tonight. But the question is whether containment is enough or whether we need to. Containment, Damien said. His voice didn't leave room for discussion. Damien, Carver's tone shifted slightly. If Hargrove is moving his timeline up, containment, Damien said again. Nobody moves on anything without my direct order. We are not in Ashwick to escalate. We are here to protect. Carver held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. Clara had been standing against the back wall listening to this exchange with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and her mind filing every piece of information with the focused attention of someone who is keeping herself functional through the deliberate act of paying attention. These contractors, she said. What are they waiting for? Carver glanced at Damien. Tell her, Damien said. Instructions, Carver said. There's surveillance right now. If the order comes from Hargrove to escalate, to what? A pause. Acquisition. She made herself stay still. Acquisition of what? The boy, Damien said. His voice was stripped of everything except the bare fact of the words. They would take him, use him as leverage against me, force a succession acknowledgement under duress, then… He stopped. Then what? Clara said. Then eliminate the inconvenience, Carver said. The stockroom was very quiet. Somewhere above them, Evan's footsteps crossed the floor. The particular uneven rhythm of a child reading while walking, navigating furniture by instinct. Clara unfolded her arms. She looked at Damien. I need to know something. Ask. The men who took me 15 years ago. She kept her voice level. Were they the same kind of men as these contractors? Yes. And they didn't… She stopped, reconfigured. I survived. Why did I survive? Something dark and old crossed Damien's face. Because the order was relocation, not elimination. Hargrove believed that removing you was sufficient. He didn't think I'd… He stopped himself. He didn't think you'd what? He didn't think I'd look for you, Damien said quietly. He thought removing you would be enough. He thought I'd move on. His jaw tightened. He was wrong about that. You looked for me. For 4 years. He said it simply, without drama. Then I stopped because I was being used. Every search I ran, every inquiry I made. Hargrove was monitoring it, feeding me false trails. I was looking in the wrong places because someone was making sure the right places were invisible. He looked at her steadily. I stopped looking because I thought you'd chosen to disappear. I thought… He stopped again, and this time something crossed his face that he didn't manage to control in time. I thought you'd decided I wasn't worth finding. The silence between them had texture. You thought I left, she said. Yes. And you spent… How long thinking that? 11 years, he said. Give or take. Clara breathed in, breathed out, looked at the map on the tablet, at the 4 small markers that represented men waiting for an order to take her child. Then she looked at Damien, at the man who had spent 11 years believing a lie that someone had designed specifically to break him, and felt something she had spent 8 years refusing to feel begin to work its way up through the careful layers she'd built over it. She was not going to cry in her stockroom in front of his security team. Okay, she said. Clarice, okay, she said, again harder. Here's what happens. Evan stays in this building today. He doesn't go to school. I'll call in sick for him. I'll tell him the pipe issue is worse than I thought. She looked at Carver. Hush. And you move 2 of your people to visible positions near the school? Not because he's going, but because I want those contractors to see them and know they've been seen. Carver glanced at Damien. Damien gave a single nod. Tonight, Clara continued, you're going to tell me everything, not the version where you protect me from the difficult parts. Everything. Damien held her gaze. Everything, he agreed. And you're going to tell me what Hargrove knows about Evan that you haven't told me yet. The pause was very brief. She wouldn't have caught it if she hadn't been watching him for 15 years, or the memory of him, which amounted to the same thing. I'll tell you tonight, he said. No. Her voice was quiet and final. Now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Carver and the 2 younger men. Give us a minute. They filed out without comment. The stockroom door closed behind them. Damien turned back to Clara. He pulled something from his coat pocket. Not the tablet, not a phone. A folded document. He set it on the work table beside the map. She reached for it. He didn't stop her. She unfolded it. It was a page from an internal organizational document. The header was in a format she didn't recognize, dense with alphanumeric codes, but the body was in plain language. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly, because the first reading hadn't fully processed. The document referenced Evan by description only. 8-year-old male, maternal surname Whitmore, confirmed biological lineage, and outlined 2 contingency options. The first was acquisition and leverage, which Carver had described. The second was more direct. She set the document down. "How long have you had this?" she said. 72 hours. When you said they were accelerating their timeline. Yes. This is why you came. Yes. His voice was very quiet. This is why I came, Clara. She looked at the document. Then she looked at the ceiling, at the sound of Evan's footsteps above her, uneven, unhurried, completely unaware of the shape of the world he was moving through. Something in her chest went very cold and then very still, the way things go still when they've made a decision so deep it doesn't feel like deciding anymore. It feels like arriving. "You said you're going to dismantle Hargrove," she said. "Yes." "Tell me exactly what that means." "The whole plan." "It means I call a council meeting. I present what I have, the intercepted communications, the historical operation from 15 years ago, the document you're holding. I expose him in front of the full council and strip his authority. And you think that's going to work?" "I think it gives us the cleanest outcome." "Or," Clara said carefully, "he sees the council meeting coming, and he moves before you can call it." Damien was quiet. "He has contractors 40 meters from my son's school," she said. "He's already moving, Damien. Whatever timeline you think you have." Her phone rang. They both looked at it on the work table. The screen showed the school's number. Clara picked up. "Hello?" "Ms. Whitmore." The school secretary, Janet. Clara knew her voice well. It was usually unhurried, pleasant. Right now it was neither. "I'm calling because this is a little unusual. There are 2 men outside the school asking about Evan's enrollment. They have identification. I've asked them to wait in the lobby, but they—" A pause. "They're asking whether Evan is in school today. I wanted to call you before I answered." Claire's eyes met Damien's. "Tell them Evan is not in school today," Clara said. "Tell them he's unwell." A brief pause. "Of course. Is everything—" "Everything is fine, Janet. Thank you for calling." She hung up. She set the phone down. She looked at Damien. "They're not waiting for an order," she said. "They're already moving." Damien had his own phone out. He was already typing. The door opened. Carver, without knocking, reading the room in 1 second. "School," Damien said to him. "I saw it," Carver said. "Keegan and Walsh are already moving. Non-engagement. Visible deterrence only." "Understood." Carver was gone. The stockroom felt smaller than it had 20 minutes ago. Clara pressed her palms flat against the work table, steadying herself against the specific physical sensation of a situation accelerating beyond the speed at which you can think ahead of it. "We need to move Evan," Damien said. "Move him where?" "The Garrity building. I've had it secured overnight. It's the safest—" "You want me to take my son out of his home and into a building you purchased yesterday," Clara said. "I want to keep him alive," Damien said. The words came out stripped of everything except what they were. "Clara, the document you're holding has a 48-hour window on the second contingency. I've had it for 72 hours and they're already at the school. That means the window has already started," she said. "Yes." She straightened up. She looked at the ceiling one more time. The footsteps above her, still moving, still unhurried. The sound of a boy who didn't know that his life had a 48-hour window written on it somewhere in a document that used alphanumeric codes in its header and plain language in its body. "I need 10 minutes, she said. "Clara, 10 minutes, she said, to pack what he needs and explain to him what I'm going to explain to him. Then we do this your way." She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, turned back. "When we get to that building, you're going to call this council meeting today. You're not waiting for a better moment because there isn't one." She looked at him steadily. "And Damien, whatever Hargrove has on you, whatever leverage he's kept in reserve for exactly this moment, I need to know before we walk into that room." She didn't wait for an answer. She pushed through the door and went up the stairs to find her son. She had exactly 10 minutes to pack his shoes and break the world he knew gently enough that he could carry the pieces. And she used every one of those minutes because that was all she had, and it was not enough. And she packed them anyway. And when Evan looked at her from his chair with the book in his lap and those dark, careful eyes, and said, quietly, "Mom, what's actually happening?" She sat down on the edge of his bed and told him enough of the truth to be honest without telling him enough to be cruel. There are some people, she said, who are unhappy that your father found us. Evan was very still. The man from yesterday. Yes. He's my dad. Yes. He absorbed this the way he absorbed everything, quietly, completely, without the performance of reaction. Then he closed his book and set it on the pillow. Are we in danger? She looked at her son. She had promised herself 8 years ago that she would never lie to him about the things that mattered. Right now we're going to somewhere safer, she said, and the people with your father are going to make sure nothing happens to us. Does he know? Evan said. My dad. Does he know we're in danger because of him? He's the one who told me. Evan nodded slowly, the nod of a child who is deciding in real time whether to trust something. Clara watched him make the decision, watched it settle in his face the way decisions settle in faces that have already learned to weigh things carefully. Okay, Evan said. He got up and went to his shelf and took down 3 books, not randomly, deliberately, the 3 he was currently reading, and put them in his backpack. Then he picked up both shoes from beside the door and put them on, both of them, without being asked. Clara stood up. Her throat was tight, but her hands were steady. Mom, Evan said, shouldering his backpack. Yeah. Is he going to fix it? She thought about Damien downstairs, the controlled face and the cracked open thing underneath it, and the document on the work table with its 48-hour window and its plain language. She thought about a man who had looked for her for 4 years and then been made to believe she'd chosen to disappear, and who had shown up anyway, in the rain, in a town that wasn't on the way to anywhere, because something in him had never fully accepted the lie. He's going to try, she said. Evan considered this. Then he walked to the door and held it open for her, with the solemn courtesy of a boy who had decided to be brave about something that was genuinely frightening, and Clara walked through it, and they went downstairs together to where Damien was waiting. When Evan came through the stockroom door and looked at Damien directly for the first time without the buffer of ordinary morning, something moved across Damien's face that he didn't try to control. He didn't speak. He just looked at the boy, his son, with an expression that had nothing in it except the raw and staggering weight of everything he hadn't known he'd lost. Evan looked back at him steadily. Then he said, Are you ready? Damien's jaw tightened. Yes, he said. Are you? No, Evan said honestly, but let's go anyway. The Garrity building smelled like old timber and cold plaster, and the specific dusty silence of a place that had been holding its breath for years. Carver had done what he'd promised. The ground floor was clean, the windows covered with temporary blackout material that looked from outside like renovation sheeting, which it was also actually functioning as, because Damien Ashcroft had learned long ago that the best cover was cover that was also true. Folding tables, laptops, a portable generator humming in the back room. 3 men Clara hadn't seen before working quietly at stations she didn't fully understand. Evan walked in, looked at all of it, and said, This is like a movie. It's not like a movie, Clara said. It's a little like a movie, Evan said, and went to sit in the corner with his backpack and his 3 books. And within 4 minutes he was reading, because Evan's primary coping mechanism was the same as his mother's and always had been. Clara stood in the center of the room and watched Damien move through it. She watched how the men responded to him, not with the performance of deference, the visible straightening and nodding that people do when they want someone to see their respect, but with something quieter and more functional. They adjusted. They reoriented. The room reorganized itself around him, the way a room does around someone who has been the gravitational center of dangerous situations for long enough that it's become atmospheric. She had known, abstractly, for 15 years what Damien was, what he'd become. She had read the clean press profiles and understood the architecture of the legitimate face built over the real one. But knowing a thing abstractly and standing in the operational nerve center of it, while your 8-year-old reads in the corner, are 2 experiences that have very little to do with each other. Carver appeared at Damien's shoulder with a tablet. Damien took it. His face did the thing it did with information. Absolute stillness, eyes moving, processing without leaking. Then he handed the tablet back and turned to Clara. Council meeting is set, he said. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Hargrove has confirmed attendance. He doesn't know what it's about? He knows I've called it. He doesn't know what I have. A pause. Or he didn't as of 2 hours ago. And now? Damien's jaw moved. Now I'm less certain. This was, Clara understood, as close as he came to saying he was worried. Walk me through the meeting, she said. What you present, what you expect, how it ends. He pulled out a chair from one of the folding tables and sat down, which was not what she expected. She'd expected him to brief her standing up, the way men in his position briefed people, from a position of controlled height. Instead, he sat, which meant he wanted her at the same level, which meant this was not a briefing. This was something else. She sat across from him. There are 7 council members, he said, including Hargrove. Of the remaining 6, I have confidence in 3. The other 3 are unknown quantities. They've been in Hargrove's orbit long enough that their loyalty is compromised, but they're not ideologues. They're pragmatists. If I can demonstrate that Hargrove's position is untenable, they'll move. Demonstrate how? The intercepted communications, the historical operation, the removal of a civilian 15 years ago without my knowledge or authorization, the document with the contingency orders. He looked at her steadily, and the DNA results. Claire was quiet for a moment. You're going to present Evan's paternity to the full council. I'm going to establish that a direct heir exists and that Hargrove has been actively concealing and threatening that heir, which makes everything he's done not just unauthorized but treasonous under the organization's own succession charter. You're using Evan as evidence. I'm using the fact of Evan, Damien said carefully. His name won't be in the room, his location won't be disclosed, but yes, his existence is the foundation of the case. Clara looked at the corner where her son was reading. He had his knees drawn up and the book propped against them, and his tea. Carver had improbably produced tea, which had elevated Carver significantly in Evan's estimation, sitting on the floor beside him. He turned a page. What's your exposure if it goes wrong? Clara said. Damien was quiet for a beat too long. Damien. If Hargrove has moved faster than I've accounted for, he said, and if he's already turned the 3 unknowns, then I walk into that meeting with insufficient support and he calls a confidence vote before I can present the evidence. And if he wins the confidence vote, then the council has the authority to remove me. Clara stared at him. Remove you? From leadership, formally. And then what happens to us? He held her gaze. Then Hargrove controls the organization, and the contingency document becomes active without anyone to countermand it. The room was very quiet except for the generator and the soft sound of Evan's page turning. So the meeting has to work, Clara said. Yes. And you have 3 confirmed votes out of 6. Yes. You need 4. Yes. Who's the 4th? That, Damien said, is what I've been working on since this morning. He glanced at Carver. Tell her. Carver set a photograph on the table between them. A man, 60s, silver-haired, captured at a distance with a long lens. Airport, by the look of the background. Reginald Tusk, Carver said, senior council member, 23 years in the organization. He and Hargrove have been publicly aligned for the past decade. Publicly, Clara said. Tusk had a daughter, Carver said. 8 years ago, she became involved with a man who turned out to be connected to a rival organization. Hargrove used it, had the man removed. The incident caused her significant harm. She's been in a private facility in Vermont since 2019. Hargrove used the daughter against Tusk, Clara said. He's been using her as leverage for 4 years. Tusk votes the way Hargrove tells him to vote. Carver paused. But, Damien said, Tusk has been moving money. Small amounts. Through channels he thinks are invisible. Into an account in his daughter's name. He looked at Clara. He's been building an exit, which means he's been looking for a reason to use it. You're going to give him the reason, Clara said. I'm going to offer him the guarantee, Damien said. His daughter's safety, the leverage destroyed, and his own clean exit from the organization in exchange for his vote tonight. Clara looked at the photograph. The man at the airport had a quality she recognized. the particular exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for a long time and has learned to carry it so constantly it's become part of their posture. When do you talk to him? 2 hours. Damien checked his watch. I'm meeting him at the Linden Inn, alone. Carver goes with you. Carver stays here. Their eyes met. She understood what he wasn't saying, that leaving Carver here was leaving his best person with her and Evan, and that this was a choice he was making consciously, and that it cost him something to walk into a negotiation with Tusk without his most trusted person in the room. All right, she said. He left at 2:15. Clara watched the car pull away from the Garrity building's rear entrance and then turned back to the operational room and did the thing she'd been doing her whole adult life, which was identify the next task and do it. She asked Carver to walk her through the communication intercepts. All of them, not the summary. She sat at one of the folding tables with a legal pad and made notes in her own shorthand, the filing system she'd developed over years of running a business alone. And she read through 15 years of invisible architecture, the careful management of Damien's search efforts, the manufactured false trails, the gradual consolidation of Hargrove's council influence, and she felt, as she read, something cold and clarifying move through her like a current. At 3:40, Evan appeared at her elbow with his empty mug. More tea? He said, which was his way of asking if he could use the electric kettle Carver had set up in the corner. Yes, she said. Make one for Carver, too. Evan assessed Carver. Milk? Black, Carver said, without looking up from his screen. Okay, Evan said, and went to make tea with the focused competence of a child who has decided that this is the contribution he can make to the current situation and is going to make it well. Clara watched him and then looked back at the intercepts and then stopped. She went back 3 pages in the document she'd been reading. A communication from 14 months ago, internal, between Hargrove and a council member identified only by an alphanumeric designation. She'd read past it on the first pass because it had seemed administrative, a reference to a scheduled review of operational personnel. She read it again. The scheduled review referenced an asset. The asset was described as embedded, long-term, proximity to the primary subject. She looked at the date, 14 months ago. She looked at the alphanumeric designation of the recipient. She looked at Carver. Carver, she said. Her voice was very even. The council member designated RC7 in the communications. Who is that? Carver looked up from his screen. Something moved across his face, quick, controlled, locked down in under a second. He was good. He was very good. But Clara had been reading people across a bookstore counter for 8 years, and she had learned to catch the things that moved fast. I'd have to cross-reference the designation key, Carver said. You've been working with these documents for 3 weeks, Clara said. You know the designation key. A pause. The room's 2 other operatives were at their stations. Neither had moved. RC7, Clara said again. Carver set down the tablet. He did it slowly, with the deliberate care of a man choosing not to make a sudden movement. Ms. Whitmore, don't. Her voice dropped. Don't manage me right now. RC7, who is it? The pause that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Carver said, Reginald Tusk. Clara's hands went flat on the table. Tusk isn't a leverage victim, she said. He's not looking for a way out. No, Carver said. He's Hargrove's man. He has been for 14 months at minimum. Yes. Which means the meeting Damien is walking into right now is a trap, Carver said. Yes. The room came into very sharp focus. Clara stood up. Call him. Carver already had his phone out. He put it to his ear. 1 ring, 2, 3, 4. He lowered the phone. No answer. Try again. I've had 2 missed calls from him since he left. I thought it was a signal issue in the building. Carver was on his feet now, moving. Walsh, get the car! One of the younger operatives was already moving. Keegan, lock down the perimeter and do not let anyone in or out of this building. What's happening? Evan said. He was standing by the kettle with 3 mugs, watching. Stay with Keegan, Clara told him. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Don't move from this room. Do you understand? Evan looked at her. He set the mugs down very carefully. Yes, he said. She was moving toward the door when Carver's phone rang. He answered it on the first ring, listened for 3 seconds, and the expression on his face told Clara everything before he said a word. Where? Carver said into the phone. Then, how bad? Then, don't move him. He lowered the phone. Damien's been taken, he said. Tusk's people were waiting at the hotel, 3 vehicles. Our man on the outside got eyes on the extraction before they moved him. He's alive, Clara. He's alive. But they have him. The word extraction sat in the air of the room like something physical. Hargrove, Clara said. Hargrove called the council meeting 30 minutes ago, Carver said. Not tonight, now. Emergency session. All 7 members. He looked at her. Without Damien present, the council has the authority to conduct business, including a leadership vote. He's going to remove Damien while he has him detained, Clara said. And once the vote passes, the contingency orders are active and there's no one left with authority to countermand them. Carver's voice was flat and professional, which was the most frightening thing about it. We have maybe 2 hours before this organization formally changes hands. Clara stood in the middle of the Garrity building and looked at the blackout sheeting on the windows and the folding tables and the humming generator and the operational reality of a situation that had just become something entirely different from what it had been 40 minutes ago. She thought about Damien in a vehicle somewhere between the Linden Inn and wherever Tusk's people were taking him. She thought about the council room, wherever it was, whatever it looked like, filling up with men who were about to vote on who controlled $4 billion and what happened to her son. She thought about the architectural blueprints. Carver, she said, Miss Whitmore, I need you and Evan to... I need you to listen to me for 30 seconds. Her voice had changed, not louder, lower, precise. The voice she used when a supplier tried to short her inventory, and she needed them to understand that she had counted every book. The organization has a coastal estate. I saw it referenced in the intercepts. The council uses it for secured sessions. It's where Hargrove called the meeting. Yes. I need the blueprints for that building. Carver stared at her. How are you going to get... I run an antiquarian bookstore, Clara said. I have access to the largest privately held collection of New England architectural records in the state. The Garrity estate... She stopped herself, recalibrated. The coastal estate Hargrove is using. When was it built? Carver checked his tablet. 1887. Rebuilt 1923. Original architect. Harmon Lyle, Clara said. He designed everything on the North Shore between 1890 and 1930. My grandmother's collection has his complete archive. She looked at Carver steadily. Every building Harmon Lyle designed has a service passage system. Maintenance corridors running between the primary entertaining rooms and the utility infrastructure. They're not on the modern floor plans because they were bricked over in most buildings during post-war renovation. She paused. But they weren't always fully sealed. Carver was very still. Get me to my store, Clara said. Give me 20 minutes in the archive, and then we go get him back. Carver looked at her for a long moment, the specific look of a professional who is reassessing what category a person belongs in. Then he turned to Keegan. Stay with the boy. Nobody in, nobody out. He looked back at Clara. 20 minutes, he said. Not 21. Clara was already moving toward the door. Ms. Whitmore, Carver said behind her. She stopped. If you're wrong about the passages, he said, we walk into that estate with no element of surprise and no exit strategy. I know, she said. And if we go in and Hargrove has already completed the vote, I know, she said again. So let's not waste time. She pushed through the door into the cold October afternoon, and behind her the Garrity building hummed with the sound of men preparing for something that had no clean outcome, only a least bad one. And she walked fast toward Chandler Street because she had 20 minutes in an archive and the memory of her grandmother's voice saying once, years ago, that the most valuable thing a map can show you is not where things are, but where things connect. She was almost to the corner of Alderman Row when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, different from the one Damien had used that morning. She answered it. Miss Whitmore. The voice was older, measured. The particular cadence of a man who has spent decades in rooms where the wrong word cost something permanent. My name is Victor Hargrove. I think it's time we spoke directly. Clara stopped walking. The afternoon traffic on Chandler Street moved past her. A delivery truck, a minivan, two women with a stroller. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a town small enough to forget. And Clara Whitmore stood on the sidewalk with her heart rate at something she could feel in her fingertips, and her voice, when it came, was the steadiest it had been all day. "I'm listening," she said. "Good," Hargrove said, "because I have something that belongs to you, and you have something that belongs to me, and I believe we can resolve this quietly without anyone getting hurt." A pause. Brief, precise. The pause of a man who times his silences. Or we can do it the other way. The choice, Ms. Whitmore, is entirely yours. Outside the hardware store across the street, a man she didn't recognize was leaning against a postal box reading a newspaper. He wasn't reading it. His eyes were on her. "What do you want?" Clara said. "Very simple," Hargrove said. "Bring me the DNA results and sign a legal declaration relinquishing any claim of paternity on behalf of the child. In exchange, Damien walks out of our meeting this evening with his position intact and his health undamaged." Another pause. "Your son's name never enters any official record. You go back to your bookstore. Everyone continues." Clara looked at the man across the street. He turned a page of the newspaper he wasn't reading. She thought about Evan in the Garrity building with his 3 books and his careful dark eyes and his honest answer. "No, but let's go anyway." And she felt something move through her that was not fear and was not anger, but was something older and more fundamental than either. Something that lived in the part of a person that forms before language does, before reason does, in the part that simply knows what it will and will not permit. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Yes." "You had me taken from my life 15 years ago," she said. "You had me relocated to another city with no ID and no phone and a threat against my life if I tried to go back. I was 22 years old." She kept her voice level. "And I spent 8 years building something out of nothing in a town that wasn't on the way to anywhere because it was the only option you left me." Silence on the line. "So when you tell me the choice is mine," Clara said, "I want you to understand something. I have been making choices under impossible conditions since I was 22 years old, and I'm very, very good at it." She looked at the man across the street. He had stopped pretending to read the newspaper. "And my answer is no." She hung up. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 3 seconds. Then she called Carver. "Change of plan," she said when he picked up. "Hargrove just called me directly. He has a man on Chandler Street watching me right now, which means he knows where I am, which means he probably knows where Evan is, which means we don't have 2 hours." She started walking. "We have less than that. How fast can you get to the store?" 4 minutes, Carver said. "Make it 3, Clara said, and broke into a run. The man across the street pushed off the postal box and began to follow her, and Clara ran toward her bookstore and her grandmother's archive and the hidden passages of a building she'd never been inside, toward the only remaining move available to a woman who had just hung up on the most dangerous man in 4 states and understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that she had crossed a line from which there was no return, and that the woman who had been carefully surviving for 8 years was gone now, replaced by someone she recognized from before, from the summer she was 22, before everything was taken, when she had still believed that the right kind of stubborn could move the world. She hit the bookstore door at a run, shoulder into it, key already in her hand. Inside, the familiar smell of paper and old wood, and the particular quiet of a place that holds stories. She went straight to the back, past the counter, through the stockroom, to the archive room her grandmother had kept locked, and Clara had kept locked after her. A steel door that looked out of place in a federal building from 1803. She had the second key on the same ring as the store key, always, because she had learned from her grandmother that the most important things should always be within reach. Inside, flat files along the left wall, rolled tubes on the right, 40 years of acquisition, organized by architect, by decade, by region. She went directly to the H drawer. Harmon Lyle, 12 projects on the North Shore between 1891 and 1928. She pulled the tubes until she found the one labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. Aldermere, Coastal Estate, 1887/1923 rebuild, and spread the blueprints across the reading table. There. The service passages, drawn in Lyle's characteristic dashed notation along the interior walls of the primary entertaining floor. A network running from the kitchen infrastructure through the billiard room, the library, and into what the original plans labeled the council chamber, a room that had apparently been designed for exactly the kind of meeting it was being used for tonight. The passage entry points were marked with small circles, 3 of them on the ground floor. One accessed from a utility structure on the northeast corner of the building's exterior. Carver came through the archive door at a controlled run, looked at the blueprints, and said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, northeast corner. Yes, Sassis, Clara said. Can you get us there without using the main approach? There's a service road off Coastal Route 9, Carver said. We used it for reconnaissance last week. He looked at her. You're sure about the passage? My grandmother documented every building in Lyle's archive personally, Clara said. She went inside each one. She annotated what was sealed and what wasn't. She pointed to a small notation in pencil beside the northeast entry point, her grandmother's handwriting, dated 1991. Accessible. Original ironwork intact. Carver took a photograph of the blueprints with his phone. Then he looked at Clara with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the reassessment, the recategorization. Walsh is outside, he said. Keegan is secure with your son. We move now. Clara rolled the blueprints and tucked them under her arm. She took one look around her grandmother's archive. The flat files, the careful decades of preservation, the handwritten labels, and thought with a clarity that surprised her that she was not afraid. She was ready. Let's go, she said. The service road off Coastal Route 9 was not a road in any meaningful modern sense. It was 2 tire tracks through scrub grass that the October wind had been working on all day. And Walsh drove it without headlights because Carver told him to, and Walsh was the kind of man who did what Carver told him without requiring a second reason. The ocean was audible before it was visible, a low continuous presence beneath the wind, and when the tree line broke, Clara saw the estate for the first time. Aldermere, 3 stories of granite and dark timber set back from the bluff, every window lit from inside, the kind of building that had been designed to communicate permanence to anyone approaching it. It communicated something different to Clara. It communicated Harmon Lyle's service passage on the northeast corner, the one her grandmother had notated in pencil in 1991. Accessible. Original ironwork intact. Walsh cut the engine 200 meters from the utility structure. The 3 of them sat in the dark car and listened to the wind and the ocean and the specific silence of a situation that has passed the point where talking about it changes anything. Security rotation, Carver said quietly, looking at his phone. Keegan pulled the drone footage from this afternoon's reconnaissance. 4 exterior positions. Rotation every 12 minutes. He checked his watch. We have a 7-minute window starting in 90 seconds. Damien, Clara said, where is he in the building? East wing, ground floor. There's a room that was originally the estate's business office. The intercepts referenced it as the holding location. Carver paused. It's not on the passage route. No, Clara said. But the council chamber is. And if we get to the chamber, we get to Hargrove, Carver said. And Hargrove is the one who gives the order to release him. Or we get to the evidence, Clara said. You told me Hargrove keeps physical documentation at every council session. Original documents. He doesn't trust digital copies. He doesn't. Including the succession charter. Yes. If the succession charter is in that room, Clara said, and if the council sees what's actually in it, the provisions for direct blood heir, the specific language about what constitutes treason against the lineage, they've all read the charter, Carver said. They've read the version Hargrove gave them, Clara said. Have any of them read the original? Carver was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with the expression she'd stopped being surprised by. The original charter was filed with the organization's founding documents in 1987, he said slowly. Hargrove took custodianship of the physical archive in 2009. When Damien's father died, Clara said. Yes. So every version of the charter that council has seen for 15 years has passed through Hargrove's hands. She held Carver's gaze in the dark of the car. My grandmother taught me that the most dangerous thing a curator can do is control what version of a document people see. Walsh said, from the front seat, 90 seconds. They got out of the car. The utility structure was a low stone outbuilding that had originally housed the estate's heating plant and had been converted at some point to electrical infrastructure. The door was iron, original, exactly as the blueprint showed it. The lock was not original. A modern padlock, heavy, the kind that announces it takes security seriously. Carver looked at it for approximately 1 second, then produced a tool from his jacket that Clara decided not to examine too closely, and 30 seconds later the padlock was open and they were inside. The passage entrance was behind the electrical panels, exactly where Lyle's blueprint showed it, a section of stone wall that wasn't quite flush with the adjacent surface, with an iron handle set into it that had been painted over so many times it was almost invisible. Almost. Clara ran her fingers along it in the dark, finding it by pressure rather than sight, and pulled. The passage opened with the sound of something that hadn't moved in decades deciding to move again. Cold air came through it, damp and mineral, the smell of stone that has been in the dark for a long time. Carver went first with a tactical light, held low. Clara followed. Walsh came last and pulled the door behind them. The passage was narrower than the blueprints had suggested. Lyle had drawn it at an optimistic width, or the stone had settled in 100 years, or both. Clara's shoulders brushed both walls as she walked. The floor was uneven and her feet found the irregularities by feel in the minimal light ahead. She counted her steps the way she counted inventory, methodically, without letting the number become a source of anxiety. At 43 steps, Carver stopped. He turned and put 2 fingers against his lips, then pointed up and to the right. Voices. Above them, filtering through the stone. Not words yet. The muffled frequency of a room where several people were talking with the particular controlled energy of men conducting formal business. The council chamber was above them, and to the right, which matched the blueprints. The passage continued another 20 meters before it reached the access point. They moved slower now, each footstep placed with deliberate care. At 61 steps, the passage turned right, and Clara saw the access point, a section of wall with the same iron handle, this one smaller, set at chest height. A thin line of light came through the gap around it, and through that gap came sound that had resolved into words. Hargrove's voice, older than it had sounded on the phone, but with the same measured cadence. The motion is on the floor. I'll ask for a show of hands. Those in favor of the resolution removing Damian Ashcroft from organizational leadership pending the conclusion of the review. Carver's hand closed around Clara's arm. Not roughly. A signal. Wait. She waited. 3 in favor. Hargrove's voice, calm, counting. Those opposed. A pause. 2 opposed. Another pause, longer. Mr. Tusk, your vote. Silence in the room above them. Mr. Tusk, Hargrove said again. The patience in his voice had an edge under it now, and then a sound Clara had not expected. A chair moving, the creak of it, someone standing up. I want to see the original charter, Tusk said. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. I beg your pardon, Hargrove said. The succession charter. The original document, not the working copy. Tusk's voice was shaking slightly, but it was the shake of a man who has decided something, rather than a man who is afraid. I want to see the provision for direct blood heir before I cast this vote. Reginald, this is hardly the show me the original charter, Tusk said, or I walk out of this room and I call every contact I have, and I tell them that Victor Hargrove refused to produce the founding document of this organization when formally requested by a senior council member. Carver looked at Clara in the dark of the passage. She looked back at him. He reached for the iron handle. The access panel opened inward into a space behind the room's interior wainscoting, a gap of 18 inches between the original wall and the decorative paneling that Harmon Lyle had installed over it in the 1923 rebuild, just wide enough for a person to move through and just dark enough to be invisible from the room itself if the panel closed behind them. Carver went in. Clara went in. The panel closed. She could see the room through the gaps in the wainscoting's decorative fretwork. A long table. 6 men. She counted quickly. 6, which meant one council member was absent. Hargrove at the far end, silver-haired, compact, with the physical stillness of a man who considers movement a concession. Tusk to his left, standing, his face rigid with the effort of holding a position he was terrified to hold. 3 men on the right side of the table, whose expressions ranged from discomfort to calculation, and one empty chair. On the table in front of Hargrove, a leather document case. Old, brass fittings, the original charter. Hargrove's hand was on it. "The charter is available for review at the appropriate time," Hargrove said, "which is after the vote, Reginald, not during." "That's not how it works," Tusk said. "I'm telling you how it works tonight." "Then I'm telling you my vote is no." Tusk's voice cracked on the last word but held. "My vote is no, Victor. You want to call it a tie? Fine, call it a tie. But I'm not voting to remove a man from his own organization on the basis of documents I haven't been allowed to verify." Hargrove looked at Tusk for a long moment, the look of a man performing patience he doesn't feel. Then he opened the document case and removed a sheaf of papers, cream-colored, aged, the particular physicality of something that predates copying machines. He slid it across the table toward Tusk. Tusk reached for it, and Carver moved. He came through the wainscoting panel fast and low, Walsh behind him, and the room detonated into motion, chairs scraping, men standing, voices colliding. And Clara came through last and moved left, away from the center of the room, toward the table, toward the document case, because that was the objective, and Carver and Walsh were handling everything between her and it. It was not clean. Rooms with 6 men in them are never clean when they suddenly contain 3 additional people and the understanding that the situation has changed. 2 of the council members on the right side of the table stood and did nothing, which was a choice. One reached for something at his hip, and Carver was on him before Clara could track the movement, efficient and controlled in over and under 4 seconds. Hargrove stood very still at the far end of the table, which was the most frightening response in the room. Clara reached the table. The charter was still in Tusk's hands. He was staring at her with an expression that was equal parts shock and the strange, desperate quality of a man watching a possibility he'd given up on suddenly materialize. "Give me the case," Clara said. To Hargrove, not Tusk. Hargrove looked at her. He was in person smaller than she'd imagined from his voice, not physically diminished, but scaled down in some way, the way things that have been enormous in your mind sometimes are when you finally stand in front of them. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "this is significantly outside your area." "The document case," she said, "the full archive." "You're a bookstore owner from a town that isn't on the way to anywhere," Hargrove said. "You have no standing in this room." "I have the DNA results of the direct blood heir to this organization in my coat pocket," Clara said. "That gives me standing." Something moved in Hargrove's face. Fast, controlled, the same quality she'd seen in Damien, the same training or the same long practice of not letting things show. But it was there, the fractional adjustment of a man recalculating. "The vote has been cast," Hargrove said. 3-2 with 1 abstention. Under the charter, a simple majority. "Read it," Clara said to Tusk. "Section 4, the blood heir provision." Tusk was already reading. His eyes moved down the page, and she watched the color leave his face. Not dramatically, not a Hollywood pallor, but a slow withdrawal, the look of a man discovering that the room he's been standing in for years has a different floor than he believed. "Victor," Tusk said. "Reginald, don't—" "The blood heir provision supersedes any council vote," Tusk said. He looked up from the document. His voice had the flatness of shock. "It supersedes it. A confirmed direct heir cannot be removed from succession or have organizational leadership transferred without the heir's formal renunciation, witnessed by all 7 council members." He set the document down. "We only have 6 people in this room." "Because I have the 7th, Clara said. Everyone in the room looked at her. "Damien is the 7th member," she said. "You called this session without him. Under the provision Tusk just read, any vote conducted without all 7 members present on a matter touching succession is void." She held Hargrove's gaze. "The vote is void, Victor. All 3 of your hands mean nothing." The silence in the council chamber was the specific silence of a structure that has just lost a load-bearing element. Hargrove moved. Not toward her, toward the door, the fast, decisive movement of a man executing a contingency. And Walsh was supposed to be covering the door, but one of the council members had done something in the chaos that put him on the wrong side of the room, and Hargrove was fast, faster than a man his age had any right to be, and he hit the door handle and was through it before anyone could close the distance. "The East Wing," Carver said, already moving. "He's going for Damien." Clara grabbed the document case. All of it. Charter. Everything inside. She went through the door after Carver. The hallway outside the council chamber was marble-floored and wide and lit with the cold overhead lighting of a building that had updated its fixtures without updating its bones. And Hargrove was 40 feet ahead of them, moving with the controlled urgency of a man who is prepared for exactly this failure and knows where his next move is. Carver was faster. He was faster by the specific margin of a man 20 years younger with better shoes on a marble floor, and he closed the distance through the main hall and into the east corridor. And Clara ran behind him with the document case under her arm, and her lungs burning because she was a bookstore owner. And she had not run like this since she was 22 years old, and running had been a survival mechanism rather than exercise. The east corridor ended in a heavy door. Carver hit its shoulder first. The room beyond was the original business office. Smaller than she'd expected, low-ceilinged, with the smell of an exterior wall and the sound of the ocean very close. And in the center of the room, in a chair, hands secured behind him with the kind of restraint that implied the people who'd applied it were professionals. Damien. He was conscious. His lip was split, and there was dried blood along his jaw from something that had happened during the extraction, and his coat was gone, and he looked up when the door opened with an expression that moved through several things very quickly: relief, assessment, anger, and something else that Clara didn't have time to process. Hargrove was in the corner of the room. He was not alone. The man standing beside him was one of the contractors, not the ones from Chandler Street, a different one, larger, with the specific physical quality of someone whose professional function is physical. He had something in his hand that made Carver stop moving. "The case," Hargrove said, looking at Clara. "Put it on the floor and slide it to me." Clara stood in the doorway of the room with the document case under her arm, and Damien in a chair 8 feet in front of her, and Hargrove in the corner, and a man between them who was holding a weapon and not visibly uncertain about it. "No," she said. "Clara," Damien said. His voice was rough. "Don't. I'm not going to, listen to me." His voice dropped, and the quality of it, controlled, urgent, precise, cut through the noise in her head. "The case doesn't matter. Put it down." "The charter?" "I know what's in the charter," he said. "I've always known what's in the charter." He looked at her steadily, and his eyes were very clear despite the blood on his face, and the thing she saw in them was not fear and was not the calculation she'd expected. "I memorized it when I was 19. My father made me memorize it." A beat. "Clara, put the case down." She looked at him. "Trust me," he said. The last time he'd said those words to her, she had been 22 years old, and the world had been a different shape. She had trusted him then, and the world had taken that and used it to break her. She put the case on the floor. Hargrove said, "Slide it." She slid it. It crossed the marble floor and stopped against Hargrove's shoe. He picked it up. He opened it. He looked at the contents, and something in his face settled. The specific relief of a man who has recovered something he cannot afford to lose. And then Damien said, "Victor, read page 12. Hargrove looked at him. "Page 12, Damien said again. "The amendment section. My father added it in 1999, after you helped him draft the blood air provision." His voice was very even. "He didn't trust you even then, so he added the amendment clause, and he made sure I knew where it was and what it said." Hargrove opened the charter. His hands, Clara noticed, were not entirely steady. He found page 12. He read it. And something happened to his face that she had not seen happen to any face in this entire day. A total dissolution of control, not rage, not calculation, but the specific expression of a man who has just discovered that the thing he has been protecting was not the thing he thought it was. "The amendment," Damien said, stipulates that any council action taken against the primary leadership or direct bloodline is automatically void if documentary evidence of that action is transmitted to the organization's legal registrar before the action is completed. He looked at Hargrove steadily. I transmitted everything to the registrar at 2:45 this afternoon, before I walked into the Linden Inn. A pause. I knew about Tusk, Victor. I've known about Tusk for 6 months. I walked in there because I needed you to move. I needed you to show the council exactly what you were willing to do. The room was absolutely still. The vote is void, Damien said. The extraction was a criminal act under the organization's own charter. Every council member who raised their hand tonight has exposed themselves to formal proceedings. He looked at Hargrove. And you are done. Hargrove stood in the corner of the room with the document case in his hands and the expression of a man whose entire architecture has failed simultaneously, every load-bearing wall at once, and the contractor beside him was looking between Hargrove and Damien with the focused attention of a man calculating which side of a room he should be on when the structure finally comes down. He stepped away from Hargrove, just one step, but it was the only step that mattered. Hargrove looked at the contractor, then at Carver, then at Clara, and the look he gave her was not the look of a powerful man. It was the look of a man who has just understood that he miscalculated what category she belonged in, and that this miscalculation was the one that cost him everything. It's over, Victor, Damien said. Carver crossed the room in 4 steps and cut the restraints. Damien stood up slowly with the careful movement of a man taking inventory of his own damage. He rolled his shoulders. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at Clara, standing in the doorway with her coat and her empty arms and her chest still heaving from running marble corridors, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the photograph she'd kept in the locked drawer for 15 years. Unguarded, uncontrolled, the thing that happened to his face when he forgot to manage it. He crossed the room to her. He stopped 2 feet away, which was the same distance he'd maintained in her bookstore, and she understood that he was still doing it, still giving her the choice of the distance between them. You put the case down, he said. You told me to. I told you to trust me. I know what you told me. He looked at her for a moment. His jaw was tight and his lip was split and there was blood drying on the side of his face, and he was the most familiar thing she had seen in 15 years. I had it handled, he said. I know, she said. You didn't need to. I know that too, she said. I did it anyway. Something shifted in his face, the almost smile, the one that remembered what smiling felt like. Then he looked past her at Carver. Get Hargrove secured. I want the council members held in the chamber until the registrar's representative arrives. He looked back at Clara. We need to call Evan. Keegan has him. I know Keegan has him. I want to hear his voice. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. Evan picked up and said immediately, without preamble, Is everyone okay? Everyone's okay, Clara said. A pause. Is my dad okay? She looked at Damien. He was watching her face, waiting. Ask him yourself, she said, and held the phone out. Damien took it. He put it to his ear. His jaw moved once, and the muscle in it that she'd been watching tighten and release all day went still. Yeah, he said into the phone. I'm okay. A pause, and she could hear Evan's voice distantly, asking something, and Damien's face did the thing it had been doing all day. The unguarded thing, the thing that cost him something to let happen. I'll explain everything when I see you, Damien said. I promise. Another pause. I know you do. He lowered the phone. He handed it back to Clara. They stood in the East Wing office of Aldermere Estate with the ocean audible through the walls and Hargrove being moved through the doorway behind them and the sound of Carver's precise instructions in the hall, and the night was not over. The registrar, the council, the formal proceedings that would take weeks or months, the dismantling of 15 years of carefully constructed architecture, none of it was over. But this part of it was. Come on, Damien said. His hand came up. Not reaching for her, not presuming, just rising slightly in the space between them, the way a question rises before it's asked out loud. Clara looked at his hand. Then she looked at his face. Then she took his hand and they walked out of the room together, into the cold marble corridor, toward whatever came next, and behind them the document case sat open on the floor of the East Wing office with the original charter splayed across it, page 12 face up, and the amendment clause her father-in-law had written in 1999 as a hedge against a betrayal he'd seen coming before anyone else had. Visible at last in the light, after 15 years of waiting in the dark to be read by the right people at the right moment. The marble corridor was cold and long, and Damien's hand was warm, and Clara held it the way she held things that mattered. Not tightly, not desperately, but with the steady pressure of someone who has decided to keep something rather than just hoping it stays. Carver met them at the end of the corridor. He looked at their joined hands and said nothing, which was the most professional thing he had done all day. And he had done many professional things. Registrar's representative is 40 minutes out, he said. I've got the council members in the chamber. Hargrove is secured. The 2 contractors from this morning's surveillance on Chandler Street have been collected by Walsh. The ones near the school, Claire said. Yes, she breathed. Keegan is en route with the boy, Carver continued. ETA, 20 minutes. Damien nodded. He had not let go of Clara's hand. She had not let go of his. These were facts they were both aware of, and neither was addressing, which was its own kind of address. The 3 council members who voted, Damien said, separate them before the registrar arrives. I want individual accounts of what Hargrove told them about tonight's session. If they were operating under coercion or incomplete information, that factors into the proceedings. And if they weren't, Carver said, then the proceedings will reflect that too, Damien said. His voice was even. I'm not protecting anyone who knew what they were voting for. Carver nodded and moved off down the corridor. Clara and Damien stood alone in the cold hallway, with the ocean somewhere beyond the walls and the specific silence of a building in which something enormous has just finished happening. Damien's thumb moved once across her knuckles, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that isn't quite voluntary. Page 12, Clara said. Page 12, he agreed. You walked into that hotel knowing it was a trap. I needed Hargrove to commit, he said. I needed him on record, in front of witnesses, having taken action. The intercepts alone weren't enough. I needed the act. You used yourself as bait. I've done worse with less reason. She looked at him, the split lip, the dried blood, the absolute steadiness of a man who had calculated the odds of a room he was walking into and walked in anyway. That was reckless, she said. Yes. It worked. Yes. Don't do it again, she said, the almost smile, closer to an actual smile this time. I make no promises. Outside, headlights swept across the estate's front windows, a car coming up the main approach, and Clara knew before it stopped that it was Keegan, and she moved toward the front entrance without deciding to. The instinct of a mother whose child has been in the care of someone else for too long. The door opened, and Evan came through it at a controlled pace that collapsed into a run when he saw her, and Clara caught him with both arms and held on with the ferocity of 8 years of surviving and 15 years of loss, and 1 day of understanding exactly how close all of it had come to going differently. Evan held on just as hard. Then he pulled back and looked past her at Damien, who had stopped in the entrance hall and was watching them with an expression that had nothing controlled about it anymore. Nothing managed, nothing locked down. Just the raw, open face of a man standing at the edge of something he had believed, for 11 years, he had permanently lost his right to. Evan looked at him for a long moment. Then he walked over, stood in front of Damien, and held out his hand. Damien looked at the hand. Then he crouched down to Evan's level, slowly, with the stiffness of a man whose ribs had taken something during the extraction, and he shook it, formally, the way Evan had offered it. You kept your promise, Evan said. Damien looked at him. What promise? You said you'd explain everything when you saw me. I did say that. So, Evan's dark eyes were steady and direct and completely his father's. Explain. And for the first time in the entirety of this long, violent, irreversible day, Damien Ashcroft smiled. Not the almost smile, not the thing that remembered what smiling felt like, but the real one, unguarded and complete, and said, It's going to take a while. That's okay, Evan said. I brought books. It took 3 hours. Damien sat on the floor of the Aldermere Estates entrance hall, with his back against the wall, and his legs stretched out and Evan cross-legged beside him with one of his 3 books open in his lap, but not being read. And he explained, "Not everything, not the versions of everything that a child should not carry, but enough. The true version of enough." He explained that he had known Clara a long time ago, and that they had been separated by someone who had decided their being together was a problem that needed solving. He explained that he had not known about Evan, and that this was not an excuse and not an apology, but simply a fact that he wanted Evan to have. He explained that the men who had been moving around Ashwick that day were gone now and would not be coming back. Evan listened to all of it with his book in his lap and his dark eyes moving between Damien's face and the middle distance, the way he processed things that required the full architecture of his attention. He asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one going directly to the structural element of the story that mattered most. The first was whether Clara had been in danger tonight. The second was whether the men who had taken her 15 years ago would face any consequence. The third was the one that made Damien's chest do something he hadn't felt since he was young enough to still be surprised by his own reactions. "Did you want to find us?" Evan asked. "Before you found the letter, I mean. Did you want to?" Damien looked at the boy, his son, a fact that still arrived in his chest with the force of something structural rather than something felt, and he said, "Every day, for 15 years. Evan absorbed this. Then he opened his book and began to read, which meant the conversation was over and he had filed what he needed and was done processing for now. And Damien sat beside him in the cold entrance hall and let the silence settle around them both like something that fit. Clara was in the East Wing with Carver and the registrar's representative, a compact woman named Alderton, who had arrived 42 minutes after Carver's call and moved through the council chamber with the brisk authority of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Clara was not a lawyer and had no standing in the formal proceedings, but Alderton had taken one look at the document case and the charter and the annotated amendment on page 12 and said, with the flatness of professional assessment, someone kept very good records. "My grandmother taught me," Clara said. Alderton looked at her. "Your grandmother wasn't in this organization." "No," Clara said, but she understood that the only defense against people who control documents is knowing the documents better than they do. Alderton held her gaze for a moment. Then she went back to work. Victor Hargrove was processed at 2 a.m, not by police, not yet, though that was coming, in the form of a federal inquiry that Alderton had indicated was already in preliminary stages based on financial irregularities that had nothing to do with Damien and everything to do with 15 years of Hargrove treating the organization's legitimate assets as a personal instrument. The processing that happened at 2 a.m. was internal, formal, conducted in the council chamber with all 7 members present. Damien included, his lips split and his jaw bruised, and his posture as straight as it had been at 8 o'clock that morning. And it was, by any measure, complete. Hargrove sat at the end of the table where he had always sat, but the quality of the room around him had changed. The 3 council members who had raised their hands had been interviewed separately and their accounts collected. 2 of them had been operating on information Hargrove had curated specifically to make Damien appear to have already resigned. 1 had known. Those distinctions mattered, and Alderton had made certain they were documented. Hargrove was stripped of his council position, his custodianship of the organizational archive, and his authority over every subsidiary and legitimate business entity under the umbrella. He did not speak during any of it except once, at the very end, when Damien asked him directly, not for the council's record, but for himself. Why? The room waited. Hargrove looked at Damien with the eyes of a man who has run out of architecture to stand behind. "Your father built something," he said. "You were going to give it away, for a woman, for a child." He said it without heat, just the flat conviction of a man who had believed something completely. "I spent 30 years building this organization alongside your father. I was not going to watch it dissolve because his son fell in love." "You were going to kill my son," Damien said. "I was going to eliminate a complication," Hargrove said. "That's all it ever was." The room was very quiet. Damien looked at him for a long time. Not with anger. The anger had burned through sometime during the 3 hours in the entrance hall, leaving something colder and more permanent in its place. "My father trusted you," he said. "He trusted you enough to draft the succession charter with you. He trusted you enough to tell you about page 12. He paused. "And you spent 15 years using that trust to build a position for yourself inside something you helped create." "Yes," Hargrove said. "That's the part I can't forgive," Damien said. "Not what you did to Clara. Not the contingency orders. The trust." His voice was even and final. "My father's trust." He stood up. The meeting was over. The formal federal inquiry opened 6 weeks later. It was not Damien who initiated it, or not directly. The financial irregularities Alderton had referenced turned out to be the visible edge of a structure that, once the organizational archive was made available to the right people under the right conditions, revealed itself to be something that federal investigators had been circling for years without being able to penetrate. The legitimate businesses were cooperative. The documentation was thorough. Damien's attorneys made certain that cooperation was visible and on record, because cooperation was the difference between the outcome that allowed him to keep building what he was building and the outcome that didn't. It took 7 months. Clara knew in general terms what those 7 months contained for Damien: the depositions, the asset reviews, the careful surgical process of extracting the legitimate from the illegitimate, the long, expensive work of making something clean that had never been entirely clean. She knew because he told her in the specific way he had developed of telling her things, directly, without softening, giving her the information and trusting her to hold it without requiring that he manage her reaction to it. This was new. It was also, she recognized, the version of him she had known at 22, before the weight of what he'd inherited had taught him to manage everything. The weight was still there, but something in the management had shifted. She did not make it easy for him. She was not built for easy, and she had never pretended otherwise. There were conversations that took 3 attempts across as many weeks, because the first 2 attempts ran into the specific collision of 2 people who had each spent 15 years developing completely independent internal architectures and now had to find a way to be in the same room without those architectures requiring demolition. There were nights when Evan was asleep, and Clara sat at her desk in the apartment above the bookstore and looked at the locked drawer and felt the full weight of what had been taken from her and understood that forgiveness was not a decision you made once. It was a decision you made repeatedly, in small increments, on days when it cost something and days when it cost more than that. She made it. Not because the past had been revised. The past was exactly what it was, exactly as heavy and exactly as permanent as it had always been. But because she was 30 years old, and she had a son who deserved to know his father, and a life that deserved to be larger than the survival architecture she had built inside it. She made it because she chose to. Every morning, incrementally, like inventory. What? The Garrity building opened in March. Damien had hired an architect from Providence who specialized in historic renovation, and the work had taken 4 months and had been conducted with a fidelity to the original structure that the Ashwick Historical Society found almost unreasonably pleasing. The ground floor became a community space, meeting rooms, a small performance area, a reading room that Clara had not been consulted about, but that bore unmistakably the influence of someone who had spent considerable time in a bookstore and understood what made a reading room work. The upper floors were office space for the legitimate businesses that Damien was building in Ashwick, because he had decided, with the particular quiet determination that characterized his decisions, that Ashwick was where his family was, and therefore Ashwick was where he was going to put down whatever roots a man like him was capable of putting down. Margaret Holt from the hardware store attended the opening and told Clara afterward that the British investor had very good taste in reading lamps, and that she had always thought the Garrity building had potential. "It did," Clara agreed. "Are you two—" Margaret began, with the specific energy of a small-town woman who has been exercising restraint for months and has reached her limit. "Margaret," Clara said, "I'm just asking." "I know what you're asking." "The whole town is asking, Clara. We're just too polite to do it directly, except I'm doing it directly." Clara looked at her. Then she looked through the new reading room window at Damien on the other side of the glass, in conversation with the Providence architect, gesturing at something structural with the focused attention he brought to problems he considered important. Evan was beside him, also looking at the thing being gestured at, also focused, their profiles nearly identical in the afternoon light coming through the restored windows. "We're figuring it out," Clara said. Margaret considered this. "That's actually a pretty good answer," she said. "Achats." The letters arrived in April. Damien found them in the organizational archive during the asset review process, a file that had been mislabeled and filed under a subsidiary designation, which was either a clerical error from 1999 or a deliberate obscurement, and given what they had learned about the archive's custodian, it was not a clerical error. 15 letters. Clara's handwriting on the envelopes, the address in Manchester where Damien had been living in the summer they met, postmarked across an 18-month span beginning 2 months after she disappeared. She had written to him. For 18 months, she had found ways to write. From Halifax, from a post office 2 towns over from where she'd been relocated, using names that weren't hers on envelopes that held the only evidence that she had not, in fact, chosen to disappear. 15 letters that had been intercepted, filed, and held in a mislabeled folder for 15 years by a man who had understood that even the perception of abandonment was a weapon. Damien brought them to her on a Tuesday evening in April. He set them on the counter of the bookstore without explanation because they didn't require one, and he stood back while she looked at them, at her own handwriting on 15 envelopes, at the postmarks that mapped 18 months of trying, and she didn't cry in the way she had told herself she wouldn't cry. She cried in the way that things actually come out, not cleanly, not cinematically, but the real kind. The kind that makes your face do things you can't control and your breathing go ragged and uneven and your hands shake when you pick up the first envelope and verify that it is, in fact, the thing it appears to be. Damien sat on the stool behind the counter, and he did not say anything helpful. He was not, she had learned, a man who said helpful things in moments that didn't require help. He was a man who stayed, which was, as it turned out, the thing she had actually needed. She read 3 of the letters that night. The rest she put in the locked drawer, where the photograph had been, because they were hers, and she was going to take them in her own time. In May, Evan asked if he could change his name, not his full name. He was specific about this, with the precision he brought to all requests that mattered to him. Not Whitmore. He wanted to keep Whitmore, but he wanted to add Ashcroft. He had looked up the legal process, he told Clara, on the library database at school, and it was actually not that complicated, and he had printed out the relevant form. He produced the form. Clara looked at it. She looked at her son, standing in the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon with a printed government form and the calm, prepared expression of a child who has thought this through completely and is presenting his case with evidence. "Have you talked to your father about this?" she said. "Not yet," Evan said. "I wanted to ask you first." She looked at the form, then at him. "Why?" "Because you're the one who kept us safe," he said. It wasn't a performance, and it wasn't flattery. It was just what he believed, stated as fact the way he stated everything. "And I didn't want you to think that adding his name meant I was taking away yours." Claire's throat went tight in the specific way it went tight when Evan did the thing he did, which was see the actual shape of something and say it plainly without understanding that most people spend their whole lives not being able to do that. "Okay," she said. "Yeah?" "Yeah," she said. "Call your father, Morshad." The name change was finalized in June. Evan Whitmore Ashcroft. The hyphen had been his suggestion, a compromise that satisfied the geometric precision of his mind. Both names, equal weight, neither one subordinating the other. The judge who processed the paperwork asked if there was any opposition to the petition. There was not. She signed it in under 3 minutes, and Evan shook her hand with the same solemn formality he had used when he shook Damien's hand in the East Wing office of Aldermere, and the judge looked at him over her glasses and said, "Young man, you have very good manners." "My mother taught me," Evan said. Damien dissolved the criminal succession in July. It was not a single act. It was a series of them, conducted over months with legal counsel and the organizational registrar, and in some cases with the direct participation of federal oversight. And the full untangling of it would continue for years, in ways that Damien was transparent about with Clara and transparent about in the legal record. The legitimate assets were restructured under a holding company, A charitable foundation was endowed with a portion of the restructured assets, focused specifically on legal aid for families displaced by organized crime activity. Clara had not suggested this. She had not needed to. Damien had arrived at it by himself, through whatever internal process produced decisions in a man who had spent 15 years building an empire and then chose, at the first available moment, to dismantle the part of it that required people to disappear. He kept the legitimate businesses. He kept Ashwick. He kept the reading room in the Garrity building. He kept, most importantly, the Tuesday evenings, which had become the fixed point of their week. Dinner at the apartment above the bookstore. The three of them, with whatever Evan was currently reading spread across the table alongside the food, because Evan did not consider reading and eating to be incompatible activities, and Clara had stopped arguing about it in 2019. Tuesday evenings where Damien sat in the chair that had become his chair and helped Evan with mathematics that Evan didn't need help with but accepted anyway, because he had figured out that his father found it satisfying to contribute to something that was clearly going well, and Evan was generous enough to let him. Tuesday evenings where Clara and Damien talked, sometimes, after Evan was in bed, in the specific way they had developed, directly, with the weight of what they'd both accumulated, neither of them performing ease they didn't feel, but both of them choosing, consistently, to stay in the room. It was not a clean thing. It was not the thing Clara had imagined at 22 that loving someone would look like. It was built out of 15 years of scar tissue on both sides and the specific effort of two people who had each learned, in the hardest possible school, that the alternative to trying was a life built entirely on survival, and that survival alone was not a life. October came back around as October does. A year since the rain on Chandler Street, a year since the bell above the bookstore door had rung at 9:03 on a Tuesday morning, and a man in an expensive coat had stood in her stacks looking at the shelves like he was buying time. Damien was on the porch when Clara came down. The bookstore porch, the narrow one facing Chandler Street, where the maple at the corner had gone the same deep red-orange it went every year and was dropping its leaves in the same wet clumps she had watched drop every October since she'd moved back. He had 2 cups of coffee, because he had learned how she took it in the way that people learn things about each other when they are paying attention, and he held one out when he heard the door. She took it. She stood beside him and looked at the street. "Evan asleep?" he said. "He's reading," she said. "He'll be asleep in 20 minutes when his eyes give out." He finished the cartography book. He finished it twice. He started it a 3rd time. Damien looked at the street. A car went past. The maple dropped a cluster of leaves onto the porch railing, and neither of them moved to clear them. "I've been thinking," Damien said. "About what?" "About the store," he said. "The east wall. The shelving unit your grandmother installed is pulling away from the stud. I can have someone look at it." Clara looked at him. "You've been thinking about my shelving unit." "It's been pulling away since August. I've been waiting for you to mention it. I was going to fix it myself." "I know you were." She looked at the street. She drank her coffee. The maple dropped another leaf. "You can have someone look at it," she said. He nodded. They stood on the porch in the October evening, and the town went about its ordinary business around them. A dog walker, a couple from the college, the lights of the hardware store going off across the street as Margaret locked up for the night. Ordinary Tuesday evening in a town small enough to forget, in a life that had been rebuilt from nothing twice, and was now, improbably, in the process of becoming something that didn't require rebuilding. The window above them lit up. Evan's room, the lamp going on, which meant he'd switched from the overhead